The same centralizing hand that ran a war then went on to run an entire hemisphere's development.
And today, we discover what happens when one distant office decides an entire continent's poverty for it.
Decides efficiently, Alexis, which is more than scattered local councils ever managed on their very best day.
Efficient decisions built entirely elsewhere are not the same thing as decisions a people actually chose for themselves.
This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
Alexis, our friend, did not stop at the Pentagon. He became president of the World Bank and applied the very same instinct to global development, tripling the staff and centralizing lending decisions that had once been scattered across dozens of regional judgments.
A man leaves one continent shaped entirely by his own hand and immediately seeks a second, larger continent to shape the same way. I confess I am almost impressed by the ambition, even as I am horrified by the method.
An institution that lends money to half the developing world needs a single coherent strategy, Alexis, not 40 competing regional offices each, inventing their own rules as they go.
For anyone joining us who does not know the shape of this, let me explain plainly. Before this centralization, local bank officers who actually lived among the people they served made judgment calls suited to their specific country. Afterward, one man in Washington set the philosophy, and every region was expected to apply it uniformly, regardless of what the ground actually looked like.
Uniform philosophy applied consistently is not a flaw. It is the entire point of building an institution rather than a loose collection of well-meaning individuals.
I call this precise danger soft despotism when it happens inside a nation, and I see no reason to rename it when it happens across an entire hemisphere instead. A power that manages every detail of a people's welfare from a distant capital, however benevolent its intentions, reduces those people to recipients rather than citizens of their own development.
Let me steelman that claim honestly, Alexis, before I take it apart for the pleasure of the exercise. Your position is that centralized development lending, no matter how well-intentioned, strips local communities of the very self-governing muscle that produces lasting prosperity, replacing it with dependence on decisions made by people who will never live with the consequences.
That is precisely my claim, and I notice a flicker of genuine understanding in how you phrased it.
I understand it perfectly, and still consider it a luxury poor nations cannot always afford in the short term. A starving village does not need self-governing muscle this afternoon. It needs food, and centralized institutions can move food faster than 40 competing local councils arguing about method.
Now allow me to summarize you in return, purely so I may enjoy the demolition with a clean conscience. You believe a sufficiently intelligent center can substitute its judgment for 1,000 local judgments and produce better outcomes on average, and that the loss of local agency is simply an acceptable cost of doing business at scale.
An excellent summary, though I would phrase the cost more generously.
You may phrase it however flatters you, Niccolo, but the structural adjustment loans your friend's institution attached to its lending tell the real story. Nations were required to cut public spending, open markets, and restructure their economies according to a template designed in Washington, regardless of whether that template matched their actual circumstances.
Consider the alternative honestly for one moment, Alexis. 40 regional offices, each with its own philosophy, each answering to a different set of local interests, competing for the same limited pool of money, while the actual poverty they were meant to address continued entirely undisturbed by their arguing.
I have considered it, and I still prefer 40 imperfect judgments rooted in an actual place to one polished judgment rooted in nothing but a Washington office and a set of assumptions about what every nation on Earth apparently needs in common.
A template exists precisely because chaos was the alternative, Alexis. Nations mismanaging their own finances for decades were hardly proving the superiority of local judgment before the bank ever arrived.
Some of that mismanagement was real. I grant you that much freely. But a template imposed uniformly across nations with entirely different histories, resources, and social structures is not wisdom. It is convenience mistaken for wisdom. And convenience has never once been the same thing as understanding a people.
Convenience that feeds more people than the alternative is not nothing, Alexis, whatever poetic objection you attach to the word.
I am not objecting to feeding people, Niccolo. I am objecting to the idea that a distant office can permanently substitute its judgment for a nation's own political development without eventually crushing that development entirely.
A nation too fragile to survive a loan's conditions was already fragile before the loan arrived.
A nation given no chance to build its own institutions before those institutions are handed to it fully formed by outsiders will never learn to defend them when the outsiders eventually leave.
There is a specific speech worth mentioning here, since fairness occasionally suits my purposes. McNamara stood in Nairobi and named something he called absolute poverty directly, giving it thresholds, calorie counts, and mortality targets that forced governments to notice suffering they had previously been content to describe only vaguely.
I will grant that naming a problem precisely has genuine value, Niccolo, more readily than I grant almost anything else you say today. A government that cannot see poverty clearly cannot be shamed into addressing it either.
I did not expect a concession this early from you, Alexis. I nearly misplaced my composure entirely.
Do not celebrate prematurely. The concession ends exactly where the conditions attached to the lending begin. Since a nation forced to gut its own public spending to qualify for relief is not being shown its poverty, it is being handed a new poverty, designed somewhere else entirely.
Every loan carries conditions, Alexis. That is simply what a loan is. A lender who imposes no terms at all is not generous, he is careless, and carelessness has never once rebuilt an economy.
There is a difference between terms designed with a nation's particular circumstances in mind and a template stamped uniformly across dozens of countries, regardless of whether their history, their agriculture, or their politics resemble each other in any meaningful way.
A template exists because time is short and expertise is scarce, Alexis, not because anyone involved wished to erase a nation's particularity out of spite.
Intent has never once been my objection to you, Niccolo. My objection has always been that a system built for speed and scale will, by its very nature, treat particularity as an inconvenience to be smoothed over rather than a truth to be respected, no matter how kind the men designing it believe themselves to be.
That is precisely why the outsiders should never leave too quickly, Alexis.
Then you have just described an empire, not a bank.
Every lasting institution looks like an empire to someone standing outside it.
And every empire calls itself an institution right up until it collapses.
This one fed millions before it collapsed, if it ever does.
Fed them and taught them nothing about feeding themselves, Niccolo.
Well, I believe that concludes today's rather heated tour of the developing world.
Heated is a generous word for watching a man defend an empire while insisting it was only ever paperwork.
If you found my composure impressive under obviously sentimental attack, the efficient thing to do is like this video without delay.
Or subscribe simply to see whether his paperwork ever admits what it actually costs the people living underneath it.
It has admitted plenty, Alexis. You simply prefer the version where every ledger hides a crime.
I prefer the version where a ledger is asked to explain itself before millions of people are asked to live inside its conclusions.
Subscribe regardless, and watch the final part, where his little platoons finally meet their match.
Subscribe regardless, and watch the final part, where his empire finally meets its conscience.